History of the World by J. M. Roberts. Book 8, The Latest Age. Chapter 2, A New World Order. The Middle East. Pan Arabism had too much to overcome. For all the impulse to united action stemming from anti Israeli and anti Western feeling. The Hashemite kingdoms, the Arabian sheikdoms, and the Europeanized and urbanized states of North Africa and the Levant all had widely divergent interests and very different historical traditions. Some of them, like Iraq or Jordan, were artificial creations whose shape had been dictated by the needs and wishes of the European powers after 1918. Some were social and political fossils. Even Arabic was, in many places, a common language only within the mosque, and not all Arabic speakers were Muslims. Although Islam was a tie between many Arabs, for a long time it seemed of small account. In 1950, few Muslims talked of it as a militant, aggressive faith. It was only Israel that provided a common enemy and thus a common cause. Hopes were first awoken among Arabs in many countries by a revolution in Egypt, from which there eventually emerged a young soldier, Gamal Abdel Nasser. For a time, he seemed likely both to unite the Arab world against Israel and to open the way to social change. In 1954, he became the leader of the military junta that had overthrown the Egyptian monarchy 2 years previously. Egyptian nationalist feeling had, for decades, found its main focus and scapegoat in the British, still garrisoning the Canal Zone, and now blamed for their part in the establishment of Israel. The British government, for its part, did its best to cooperate with Arab rulers because of its fears of Soviet influence in an area still thought crucial to British communications and oil supplies. The Middle East, ironically, given the motives that had taken the British there in the first place, had not lost its strategic fascination for the British after the withdrawal from India. It was a time of strong anti Western currents elsewhere in the Arab world too. In 1951, the king of Jordan had been assassinated. In order to survive, his successor had to make it clear that he had severed the old special tie with Great Britain. Further west, the French, who had been forced to recognize the complete independence of Morocco and Tunisia soon after the war, faced troubles by 1954 that had grown into an Algerian national rebellion, which was soon to become a full scale war. No French government could easily abandon a country where there were over 1 million settlers of European stock. Moreover, oil had just been discovered in the Sahara. In the context of this stirring Arab world, Nasser's rhetoric of social reform and nationalism had wide appeal. His anti Israeli feelings were not in doubt, and he quickly had to his credit the success of an agreement with Great Britain for the evacuation of the Swiss base. The Americans, increasingly aware of Russian menace in the Middle East, meanwhile looked on him for a time with favor as an anti colonialist and potential client. He soon became appealing to them. The guerrilla raids on Israel from Egyptian territory, where the most important Palestinian refugees camps lay, provoked irritation in Washington. In 1950, the British, French, and Americans had already said they would provide only limited supplies of arms to the Middle East states, and only on such terms as would keep a balance between Israel and the Arabs. When Nasser carried off an arms deal with Czechoslovakia on the security of cotton crop, and Egyptians recognized communist China, second thoughts about him hardened. By way of showing displeasure, an American and British offer to finance a cherished project of internal development, a high dam on the Nile, was withdrawn. As a riposte, Nasser seized the assets of the private company that owned and ran the Suez Canal, saying its profits should finance the dam. This touched an old nerve of British sensibility. Instincts only half disciplined by imperial withdrawal seemed for once to be coherent both with anti communism and with friendship towards more traditional Arab states, whose rulers were beginning to look askance at Nasser as a revolutionary radical. The British Prime Minister, Anthony Eden, too, was obsessed with a false analogy, which led him to see Nasser as a new Hitler, to be checked before he embarked upon a career of successful aggression. As for the French, they were aggrieved by Nasser's support for the Algerian insurrection. Both nations formally protested over the canal's seizure and, in collusion with Israel, began to plan his overthrow. In October 1956, the Israelis suddenly invaded Egypt to destroy, they announced, bases from which guerrillas had harassed their settlements. The British and French governments at once said freedom of movement through the canal was in danger. They called for a ceasefire. When Nasser rejected this, they launched, on Guy Fawkes Day, first an air attack and then a seaborne assault on Egypt. Collusion with Israel was denied, but the denial was preposterous. It was a lie, and worst still, from the first, incredible. Soon the Americans were thoroughly alarmed. They feared advantage for the USSR in this renewal of imperialism. They used financial pressure to force a British acceptance of a ceasefire negotiated by the United Nations. The Anglo French adventure collapsed in humiliation. The Suez affair looked and was a Western disaster, but in the long run, its main importance was psychological. The British suffered most. It cost them much goodwill, particularly with the Commonwealth, and squandered confidence in the sincerity of their retreat from empire. It confirmed the Arabs' hatred of Israel, the suspicion that it was indissolubly linked to the West made them yet more receptive through Soviet blandishment. Nasser's prestige soared still higher. Some were bitter too that Suez had, at a crucial moment, distracted the West from Eastern Europe, where a revolution in Hungary against its Soviet satellite government had been crushed by the Russian army while the Western powers fell out. Nevertheless, the essentials of the region's affairs were left by the crisis much as before, animated by a new wave of pan Arab enthusiasm, though they might be. Suez did not change the balance of the Cold War or of the Middle East. In 1958, an attempt was made by Ba'ath sympathizers to unite Syria and Egypt and in a united Arab Republic that briefly bore the fruit in 1961. The pro Western government of the Lebanon was overthrown and the monarchy of Iraq swept aside by revolution that year too. These facts heartened pan Arabists, but differences between Arab countries soon reasserted themselves. The world watched curiously when American forces were summoned to the Lebanon and British forces to Jordan to help maintain their governments against pro Nasser forces. Meanwhile, fighting went on sporadically on the Syrian Israeli border, although the guerrillas were, for a time, held in check. However, from Suez until 1967, the most important development in the Arab world was not there, but in Algeria. The intransigence of the Pieds Noirs, the French settlers, and the bitterness of many soldiers who felt they were asked to do an impossible job there nearly brought about a coup d'etat in France itself. The government of General de Gaulle, nevertheless, opened secret negotiations with the Algerian rebels and in July 1962, After a referendum, France formally granted independence to a new Algeria. Angrily, a million Noirs migrated to France to embitter her politics. Ironically, within 20 years, France was to benefit from over a million Algerian immigrant workers whose remittances home were essential to the Algerian economy. As Libya had emerged from the United Nations trusteeship to independence in 1951, the entire North African coast outside the tiny Spanish enclaves was now clear of European supremacy. Yet external influences still bedeviled the history of the Arab lands as they had done ever since the Ottoman conquests centuries before, but now did so indirectly through aid and diplomacy, as the United States and Russia sought to buy friends. The United States labored under a disadvantage. No American president or Congress could abandon Israel. The importance of Jews among American voters was too great, although President Eisenhower had been brave enough to face them down over Swiss, even in an election year. In spite of America's clean hands, therefore, Egyptian and Syrian policy continued to sound anti American and prove irritating. The USSR, on the other hand, had dropped its early support of Israel as soon as it ceased to be a useful weapon with which to embarrass the British. Soviet policy now took a steady pro Arab line and assiduously fanned Arab resentment over survivals of British imperialism in the Arab world. Marginally, too, the Russians earned a cheap bonus of Arab approval in the later 1960s by harassing their own Jews. Meanwhile, the context of the Middle East's problems was slowly changing. In the 1950s, there were two important developments concerning oil. One was a much greater rate of its discovery than hitherto, particularly on the southern side of the Persian Gulf, in the small sheikdoms then still under British influence, and in Saudi Arabia. The second was a huge acceleration of energy consumption in Western countries, especially in the United States. The prime beneficiaries of the oil boom were Saudi Arabia, Libya, Kuwait, and some way behind Iran and Iraq, the established major producers. This had two important consequences. Countries dependent upon Middle Eastern oil, the United States, Great Britain, Germany, and soon Japan, had to give greater weight to Arab views in their diplomacy. It also meant big changes in the relative wealth and standing of Arab states. None of the three leading oil producers was either heavily populated or traditionally very weighty in international affairs. The bearing of these changes was still not very evident in the last Middle East crisis of the 1960s, which began when a much more extreme government took power in Syria with Soviet support in 1966. The king of Jordan was threatened if he did not support the Palestinian guerrillas, organized since 1964 as the Palestinian Liberation Organization or PLO. Jordanian forces therefore began to prepare to join in an attack on Israel with Egypt and Syria. But in 1967, provoked by an attempt to blockade their Red Sea port, the Israelis struck first. In a brilliant campaign, they destroyed the Egyptian Air Force and army in Sinai and hurled back the Jordanians, winning in 6 days, fighting new borders on the Suez Canal, the Golan Heights, and the Jordan. For defense, these were far superior to their former boundaries, and the Israelis announced that they would keep them. This was not all. Defeat had ensured the eclipse of the glamorous Nasser, the first plausible leader of pan Arabism. He was left visibly dependent on Russian power. A Soviet naval squadron arrived at Alexandria as the Israelis' advanced guards reached the Suez Canal, and on subsidies from the oil states. Both demanded more prudence from him, and that meant difficulties with the radical leaders of the Arab masses. Yet, the Six-Day War of 1967 solved nothing. There were new waves of Palestinian refugees. By 1973, about 1,400,000 Palestinians were said to be dispersed in Arab countries, while a similar number remained in Israel and Israeli occupied territory. When the Israelis began to plant settlements in their newly won conquests, Arab resentment grew even stronger. Even if time, oil, and birth rate seemed to be on the Arab side, not much else was clear. In the United Nations, a group of 77 supposedly non aligned countries achieved the suspension of Israel from certain international organizations and, perhaps more important, a unanimous resolution condemning the Israeli annexation of Jerusalem. Another called for Israel's withdrawal from Arab lands in exchange for recognition by its neighbors. Meanwhile, the PLO turned to terrorism outside the disputed lands to promote their cause. Like the Zionists of 1890s, they had decided that the Western myth of nationality was the answer to their plight. A new state should be the expression of their nationhood. And like Jewish militants in the 1940s, they chose terrorism, assassination, and indiscriminate murder as their weapons. It was clear that in time there would be another war, and therefore a danger that, because of the identification of American and Russian interests with opposing sides, a world war might suddenly blow up out of a local conflict as in 1914. The danger became imminent when Egypt and Syria attacked Israel on the Jewish holy day of Yom Kippur in October 1973. The Israelis, for the first time, faced the possibility of military defeat by the greatly improved and Soviet armed forces of their opponents. Yet once again they won, though only after the Russians were reported to have sent nuclear weapons to Egypt and the Americans had put their forces on the alert around the world. This grim background, like the possibility that the Israelis themselves might have nuclear weapons they would be prepared to use in extremity, was not fully discernible out to the public at the time. This, however, was not the only way in which the crisis transcended the region. The problems of the Ottoman succession left behind in 1919, of which Israel's emergence was only a part, had been successively further poisoned, first by the interwar policies of Great Britain and France, and then by the Cold War. But it was now to become clear that there had been a much more fundamental change in the Middle East's world role. In 1945, the world's largest oil exporter had been Venezuela. 20 years later, this was no longer so, and most developed economies depended for much of their oil on the Middle East. In the 1950s and for most of the 1960s, the British and Americans had been confident of cheap and assured supplies from the region. They had managed what once had looked possible threat to their access to Iranian oil in 1953 by overthrowing an unfriendly Iranian government exercised informal controlling influence in Iraq until 1963 and had no difficulty in retaining Saudi Arabian goodwill. But the Yom Kippur War ended this era. Led by Saudi Arabia, the Arab states announced they would cut supplies of oil to Europe, Japan, and the United States. Israel had to face the frightening possibility that it might not always be able to rely on diplomatic support it had always found outside the region. It might not be able to go on counting on guilt about the Holocaust, sympathy and admiration for a progressive state in a backward region, and the weight of Jewish voters in the United States. It was not a good moment for the United States and its allies. In 1974, with 138 state members of the UN, there were for the first time majorities in the General Assembly against the Western powers over both Israel and South Africa. Though for the moment UN agreed to put a force into Sinai to separate the Israelis and the Egyptians, none of the region's fundamental problems was solved. The impact of oil diplomacy went far beyond the region, however. Overnight, economic problems that had been tolerable in the 1960s became acute. World oil prices shot up. Dependence on oil imports everywhere played havoc with balance of payments problems. The United States, floundering in what had become an Indo-Chinese morass, was badly shaken. Japan and Europe appeared to face full-scale recession. Perhaps it seemed a new 1930 was on its way. At any rate, the golden age of assured economic growth was over. Meanwhile, it was the poorest countries among the oil importers that suffered most from the oil crisis. Many of them were soon having to face rocketing price inflation and some a virtual obliteration of the earnings they needed in order to pay interest on their large debts to foreign creditors. Africa. The impact of higher oil prices was great in much of the Africa. In the 1950s and early 1960s, that continent had undergone a startling, rapid process of decolonization. It had been exhilarating but had left behind some fragile new nations, especially south of the Sahara. France, Belgium, and Great Britain were the major imperial powers concerned with what was, on the whole, a perhaps surprisingly peaceful process. Italy had lost her last African territories in 1943, and only in Algeria and the Portuguese colonies was there much blood spilled in the process of liberation. The Portuguese finally giving up after domestic revolution in 1974. Thus, the Iberians, who had led the European adventure of overseas dominion, were almost the last to abandon it. There was plenty of bloodshed to come after the roll up of empire. It is true, when Africans set about African, but troubles tended to arise for the French and British only when there were significant white settler communities to consider. Elsewhere, both French and British politicians proved anxious to retain influence if they could by showing benevolent interest in their former subjects. The outcome was a black Africa that owes its present form in the main to decisions of the 19th century Europeans. New African nations were usually defined by the boundaries of former colonies, and those boundaries have proved remarkably enduring. They often enclosed peoples of many languages, stocks, and customs over whom colonial administrations had provided little more than a formal unity. As Africa lacked the unifying influence of great indigenous civilizations, such as those of Asia, to offset the colonial fragmentation of the continent, imperial withdrawal was followed by its balkanization. The doctrine of nationalism that appealed to the Western African elites. Senegal, a Muslim country, had a president who wrote poetry in French and was an expert on Goethe, confirmed a continent's fragmentation, often ignoring important realities which colonialism had contained or manipulated. The sometimes strident nationalist rhetoric of new rulers was often a response to the dangers of centrifugal forces. West Africans combed the historical record, such as it was of ancient Mali and Ghana, and East Africans brooded over the past that might be hidden in relics, such as the ruins of Zimbabwe, in order to forge national mythologies like those of earlier nation makers in Europe. Nationalism was as much the product of decolonization in Black Africa as the cause. New internal divisions were not Africa's only or its worst problems. In spite of the continent's great economic potential, the economic and social foundations for a prosperous future were shaky. Once again, the imperial legacy mattered supremely. Colonial regimes in Africa left behind feebler cultural and economic infrastructures than in Asia. Rates of literacy were low, and trained cadres of administrators and technical experts were small. Africa's important economic resources, especially in minerals, required skills, capital, and marketing facilities for their exploitation, which could only come in the near future from the world outside. What was more, some African economies had recently undergone particular disruption and diversion because of European needs and in European interests. During the War of 1935 to 1945, agriculture in some of the British colonies has shifted towards the growing of cash crops on a large scale for export. Whether this was or was not in the long term interests of peasants who had previously raised crops and livestock only for their own consumption is debatable. But what is certain is that the immediate consequences were rapid and profound. One was an inflow of cash in payment for produce the British and Americans needed. Some of this came through in higher wages, but the spread of a cash economy often had disturbing local effects. Unanticipated urban growth and regional development took place. Many African countries were thus tied to patterns of development that were soon to show their vulnerabilities and limitations in the post war world. Even the benevolent intentions of a program like the British Colonial Development and Welfare Fund or many international aid programs objectively helped to shackle African producers to a world market. Such handicaps were the more grievous when they were compounded, as was often the case, by mistaken economic policy after independence. A drive for industrialization through import substitution often led to disastrous agrarian consequences as the prices of cash crops were kept artificially low in relation to those of locally manufactured goods. Almost always, farmers were sacrificed to townspeople, and low prices left them with no incentive to raise production. Given that populations had begun to rise in the 1930s and did so even more rapidly after 1960, discontent was inevitable as disappointment with the reality of freedom from the colonial powers set in. Nonetheless, in spite of its difficulties, the process of decolonization in Black Africa was hardly interrupted. In 1945, the only truly independent countries in Africa other than Egypt had been Ethiopia, which had itself from 1935 to 1943 been briefly under colonial rule, and Liberia, though in reality and the law the Union of South Africa was self governing dominion of the British Commonwealth and is therefore only formally excluded from that category. By 1961, 24 new African states had come into existence. They are now over 50.